I work for a consultancy firm here in Amsterdam. Our consultancy firm basically focuses on sustainable development in general, and biodiversity and natural resources is one of the topics that we focus on in our work. I've also been part of the jury for the green fashion competition for the last 2 years. So if you need any tips on what to put in your business plan to become a winner, just let me know. I will talk a bit about that also this afternoon. This afternoon there will be another presentation for 1 hour on biodiversity and the creative industry. But basically to start off with a bit more about biodiversity itself. Also from the experience that I had from the 2 former competitions, there's still always some confusion about what biodiversity exactly is. And I think one of the reasons is that it's such a wide concept. Everything basically that you do on environmental issues, on social issues, somehow has a link to biodiversity. And that, of course, makes it a difficult topic to work with. That works better. I also had a small movie, but I think I will skip it because you just had a movie. This is a movie by the CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a convention that was signed by almost every country in the world, including the Netherlands, on biodiversity, from the viewpoint that biodiversity being part of the life support system, you could say, we should make an effort to really sustain biodiversity. And basically the CBD has 3 main objectives. The first one is the conservation of biodiversity. The second one is the sustainable use of biodiversity. And the third one is the equitable sharing of the benefits that you derive from the use of genetic resources. So like companies that go into the rainforest to produce medicines, for example, from the genetic resources that you have in a rainforest, to make sure that the benefits of that are equitably shared. And those are the 3 main objectives that the CBD has. And basically everything that we do here in Europe and everything that we do here in the Netherlands on the issue of biodiversity is all linked to these 3 main targets. Looking at the definitions, let's see if this works. Yes, it does. So I don't have to stay there all the time. And there, basically, you could say there are 3 levels. The first one is the most familiar one, biodiversity being the beautiful things that you see around you. The second level is the ecosystems. This is already a level where people are not that familiar with. Biodiversity for most people is still the variety of species. And for most people it's not yet the variety in ecosystems. And the third level is also the benefits that you derive from an ecosystem, the functions that it derives. It's an umbrella term for the variety of genes, of species and of ecosystems that constitute life on Earth. So it's 3 levels that make up biodiversity. The first level is simple, the species and the genetic resources within them, so also the variety within the species. But what are the ecosystems? Well, basically ecosystems are a dynamic system of plants, animals and microorganisms and their non-living environment, which sounds rather complex, but simply said it is, for example, an area. But it could also be a grain of soil, for example. Larger ecosystems are made up of small subsystems. So areas, ecoregions are all ecosystems. And basically you could say that humans are an integral part of the ecosystems itself. Ecosystem services are the benefits that people derive from the ecosystems. For example, the provisioning service or production service, where you have the oceans, and where you can take fish from that, all depends on the services that are delivered by an ecosystem. Then how exactly is that relation? Because you saw a shift in the last few years from a focus on species, also within Dutch policy, much more towards a policy focusing on ecosystems and ecosystem services. Basically you could say a shift from biodiversity having an intrinsic value, biodiversity has the right to exist, a shift towards the value of biodiversity. So why is biodiversity important to society? And you also see a shift from a focus on species to monetarization, to exactly putting a figure, a financial figure on biodiversity. Just to make clear why it is important that we conserve and sustain biodiversity. Because of the ecosystem, the economic system that we live in, financial performance is still the main dominating factor. So if you can translate anything into finances, it will be done. Well, basically biodiversity plays an important role in the way ecosystems function and in the services they provide. So there's a link between the variety of species, the variety of genetics, and the functioning of an ecosystem. In general, you could say a more biodiverse ecosystem is a more stable system. And the system, the area, that's where you derive the ecosystem services from. That's basically what we all depend on. In the introduction movie, they mentioned soy, they mentioned palm oil. Well, the only reason that it grows is that the ecosystem where it is being grown provides the service. It provides the water, it provides the nutrients. These are all services provided by ecosystems. And biodiversity plays a role in that. Now you can also turn it around. You can also think about, okay, then what services do we need in certain areas? And what does that mean for biodiversity? And that's a shift that you now see happening also in, for example, spatial planning and also in architecture, where you start looking at an area or a region and you talk with stakeholders in the area and in the region and you decide, okay, where do we want to be with this area in 20 years' time, for example. So what services do we need? Do we want to have recreation in the area? Do we want a high production level in the area? Do we want quiet in the area? And it all can be part of the dream of people for an area in 20 years' time. And then you start to look back. Okay, then what services do we need? Then what biodiversity do we need? And then maybe even what environmental quality do we need in the area? And also that is looking the other way around. When we look back at the Dutch policy, it was always you had an environmental quality, lots of standards for that. And then you saw where you ended up with. Now you turn it around, you say, okay, where do we want to be with an area and what does that mean for environmental quality? So that's also a shift that is happening, and this is one that we will also look at this afternoon when you look at spatial planning, for example. You look at an area, you look at the ecosystem service potential of an area, you try to discuss with the stakeholders where you want to be in 20 years' time, and then how do you get there, and what does it mean for biodiversity. And of course that's a very instrumental view of biodiversity. Some people may not accept that. They will say, well, biodiversity has a right to be there in itself, even if it doesn't have any function at all. Others will say, well, biodiversity always has a function. The panda maybe in itself doesn't really have a function for people. On the other hand, because we think it's important that it stays there, it somehow has a function. So you can relate everything to functions for human beings, basically. This is kind of blurred, but it shows you the different services that ecosystems can provide. You have provisioning. Those are the most well-known, you could say. It provides for fish, for food, for clean water, those kinds of services. You have regulating services like pollination. You will need bees in an area for pollination to make sure that you can produce apples. So regulating services are the services that you need also for the provisioning services to happen. Then you have cultural services like aesthetics, recreation, education. So when you look at the tourist sector, for example, there you will have cultural services for people that they need and that they want to have in an area. And then you have the supporting services. And the supporting services are basically the services that underlie all the others. Like photosynthesis or soil formation. Those are complex processes that you will find in an ecosystem and that you will need for regulating services to happen, for provisioning services to happen, and for also in the end to get the cultural services that you need. So basically they're all also interrelated. When you have an ecosystem, you will find a potential of many of these services, and which services you're going to pick out, which services you're going to optimize, is basically up to the stakeholders of that area. And that decision will also mean that other services will go down. If you want to have agricultural production in an area, for example, the ecological service of the area will probably diminish. Because maybe you're going to have a monoculture there of soy or of palm oil. So this is basically a picture that you would have. You will have different ecosystems, including aquatic ecosystems, but also the terrestrial ecosystems, and you will have all different kinds of services that you get from that. And again, beware that biodiversity again plays a role in this. When you pick out specific species from an ecosystem may collapse or may become less stable. And that could mean in the end that certain services are not delivered anymore. So keeping biodiversity intact is of direct relevance to society. And of course, why is biodiversity now getting higher on the political agenda? Is basically because we are now actually running out of natural resources. And we are now actually starting to see that certain services that we took for granted in the decades that we had are not for sure anymore in the years to come. So you also see that some services that you did not pay for decades ago, like clean water, clean air, may become services that you're going to start to pay for. Payments for ecosystem services is a concept that is very strongly on the rise. And that again means for companies that something that was an externality in the past, they didn't pay for it, will become part of their cost-benefit analysis in the future. And so biodiversity and ecosystem services will be priced in the future. There was a large research, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the TEEP study. There's now this week, there's a conference in Leipzig in Germany about the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And they also calculated that the economic value of benefits from healthy, diverse, resilient natural ecosystems may be 10 to 100 times the cost of maintaining them. It also means that if you let go of those systems, it will be very costly to get the services back again that you want. And there have been all kinds of different calculations by this study, also for businesses, where they see, okay, we have biodiversity on one hand, ecosystems, species, and genes. You have ecosystems, goods, and services related to that. For example, when you look at the ecosystem as a whole, recreation, ecotourism, for example, but also water regulation in an area. When you look at the species level, well, food, fiber, fuel, biofuel, it's all related to specific species. And the genes, like the discovery of medicines, for example. And they try to put economic values to this, also to make sure that it is high on the political agenda. Now the relevance to you as the creative industry is that basically, well, companies have an impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services, but they also depend on it, either directly or indirectly, and definitely indirectly through your supply chains. At the moment you use materials in your products or you use materials in your buildings, you depend somehow, some way or another on biodiversity. And those services are really degraded in the last decades, you could say. Some of them went up, like for food, crops, livestock, basically because they decided, well, we want that service to be high up, because we want more agricultural production, we want more livestock, like Brazil, China, the growing economies. But many others are really going down. Genetic resources, biochemicals, medicines, water. Fresh water is becoming one of the biggest problems in the future. And these are the relations. And it looks kind of boring. There are always two sides to biodiversity. One is the very beautiful thing, also very easy to communicate, linked to services, to products, but it's also the relation part. And this is something that you should definitely know when you're going to start to work on biodiversity and design, also in the competition. Where are you as a company or as a designer? Well, basically you are there. Those are the direct drivers of change of biodiversity. An important driver is, for example, conversion of land or changing land use, turning maybe a forest into a piece of agriculture. That is a big driver of the loss of biodiversity. But also climate change. Changing climate, rising temperatures, changes biodiversity. And also biodiversity may get lost. Over-exploitation, very noticeable in the fishery sector, of course. Where they take so much fish from an ecosystem, that the ecosystem is not able anymore to really keep it on the level that you need. So that's where you are, either with your direct impact or with your indirect impact in your supply chain. And you may not even know it because maybe you didn't wonder up until now. This may impact on biodiversity. It may impact on the composition, the interactions, the numbers of biodiversity. And this will interact some way, somehow, on ecosystem functions. And like I explained, sometimes even with keystone species, as they call it, if you take them out of the ecosystem, an ecosystem may collapse. But even small changes, of course, for example, in the soil, may change the surface of nutrients, of water retention, for example. And that basically means that it changes the goods and the services that you can take from an ecosystem. And the goods are the provisioning services like food, fiber, fuel, genetic resources, biochemicals, etc., etc. But also the regulating services and the supporting services and the cultural services, as I explained. And those, again, are related to human well-being. And that is basically the relation that you will have when you look at biodiversity. It's from biodiversity to services, to the goods and services, and to human well-being. And of course, if you want to make it a circle, you will see that human well-being, of course, also impacts on indirect drivers of change, like population growth, for example. And those, again, will be linked to the direct drivers of change. Because of population growth, you will have more consumption, you may have over-exploitation, and that will, again, hit on biodiversity. And so in this way, you will have the complete circle, and it shows exactly how biodiversity is related to human well-being. A practical example, also one that I found during the green fashion competition that was mentioned a lot, because a lot of cotton is used. For example, the use of cotton. Cotton production requires a lot of water use and also a lot of pesticide use. It's the highest use of pesticides of all agricultural commodities. But the withdrawal of water for cotton production may lead to water scarcity in the cotton production area, depending on the area, of course. That may impact on the production surface of the area, for example, by means of the loss of vegetation. If you take water from the area, the water tables go down, plants cannot reach the water anymore, you lose vegetation. That may, of course, affect the agricultural use potential of the whole area, not just for cotton, but also for other, maybe food production. And that will impact on farmers, and also including, again, cotton production itself. So in the end, the dependency is very much related to the impact, of course. A big company like IKEA is investing millions of euros in a sustainable production of cotton. And that's not just because they have an impact, but also because they depend on it. Because they're basically destroying their own resources. So these are the kinds of relations that you should be looking for also within your designs. Within the supply chains that you use, within the materials that you use. How is it related to especially the key drivers of biodiversity loss? So you will have two parts basically also when you're starting to work in this competition, and then we will go into more depth this afternoon. There's the understanding part. Recognize the value of biodiversity. So think about the relations that I just showed. Why is it important, biodiversity? Not just because it's beautiful, which is a cultural service, but also because of many other services. Understand the key drivers of biodiversity loss, the pressures, you could say, the habitat destruction because maybe of the use of pesticides or the use of water but also land conversion for the production of palm oil, of soy, of cotton. Keep in mind also that pressures plus location is impact, and that's the difficult one. Because a pressure in one area, for example, withdrawing water from the groundwater, may not have an impact at all in an area where there's plenty of water. But it may have a huge impact in an area where you already have a water scarcity. So pressures in one area may be a problem, and in the other area they may not be a problem. And that's what makes also biodiversity a bit of a challenge, you might say, is that it is very location specific. But there's of course the interesting part to tackle that challenge. And recognize that ecosystem services have stakeholders. Because who decides what service you want in a specific area? Who decides whether it is a problem that you grow cotton in an area, which means that you do not have a forest there? That's decided basically by all the stakeholders of such an area. And of course a nature conservation organization can also be a stakeholder. But also the local farmers are stakeholders, and the local governments are stakeholders. They decide which ecosystem services are important for the future of an area, and that will, of course, decide what biodiversity then do we need, or do we leave there, and what does that mean for the whole production. So it's the understanding part. If you understand that, it's the action part. So identify real or potential impacts and potential contributions to biodiversity for your production facilities, for your supply chains. Prevent or reduce the pressure or the impact. For example, eco-design. Eco-design has been around for a long time already. And now the challenge is to use eco-design with a specific focus on the key drivers of biodiversity loss, to design a product in such a way that you sustain biodiversity or maybe even improve biodiversity. And the seventh one, deliver a positive contribution. You could say design for biodiversity. Well, these are the key drivers of loss. I already mentioned most of them. Also remember that poverty is also linked, of course, to biodiversity. A big reason for the loss of biodiversity is the fact that people that do not have anything to eat will rather cut the forest and start agriculture there than leave the forest there because we in the West think it's beautiful. So there's a link between poverty and the loss of biodiversity, and there's also a very strong link between the loss of biodiversity and poverty. Because especially in most developing countries, many people depend directly on biodiversity for their production. We in many cases do not. We import everything. So a focus on designing for biodiversity also means that you take into account social issues. Because if you do not take account of things like poverty alleviation, then you will not really solve the problem. Because then again, there will be a strong driver of biodiversity loss through poverty. So look at your supply chain and remove or reduce the pressures. And of course there you have the whole life cycle. From concept, design, use of materials, production, the use phase, disposal or reuse, recycling. Concepts like cradle to cradle, of course, are relevant here. Focus on people, planet and profit. So basically you could say corporate social responsibility, including a biodiversity focus. And that also makes maybe eco-design with a specific focus on biodiversity different from eco-design in general. And what is also an interesting one, or an important one, is that it also means a change from input-output thinking to impact thinking. And what you see now for most companies, what they do is they measure how much water they use. They measure how much waste they produce. Input-output thinking. But water use in itself doesn't say anything about the impact on ecosystems or on society. And like I said, water use in one area may be a problem, but in another area it's no problem at all. And that's a shift that you see happening now, that the front runners in this area, they start also measuring and reporting their actual impact. And that means that you do not just measure how much water you use, but you are trying to find out where did the water come from, and is it from maybe from a water scarce area, and what does it mean, and what is the impact of that. Of course that takes more work, but it provides a better picture of the actual relation between a company and society. So from input, output to impact. And of course look for positive contributions, like for example pro-biodiversity products and awareness. Biomimicry is of course in many cases mentioned when you talk about architecture. Biomimicry, where you use the solutions that nature came up with basically for designing your product or maybe using it in architecture, in itself will not sustain biodiversity because maybe it even harms biodiversity. But by using the solutions in nature, you can build awareness among people that biodiversity is important, not just because it's beautiful, because it provides you with many different services, including solutions that you did not come up with yourself. So biomimicry is an important one also from the viewpoint of awareness. Pro-biodiversity products, I will go into in a bit more depth later this afternoon. What I mean there is that there are materials taken from ecosystems that provide a value for ecosystems that you can use in your product. For example, if you use the bark from specific trees from Uganda, you will make sure that people get money from the forest where those trees grow. Because they get money from the forest, they will leave the forest intact. The bark from the tree can be used again as a kind of leather for products. By using that leather, you basically sustain biodiversity because a forest stays there because you add an economical value to the product. So those are examples of positive contributions. And maybe to end with, because there's always the risk of it becoming a very boring and complex exercise, always keep in mind that you should be inspired by biodiversity, whether it is in fashion, or it is in architecture, or it is in eco-design. The reason why you're working on this competition is because of the prize money, of course, but is also because the target behind it, to leave biodiversity intact and to make sure that ecosystems can deliver their services also in the future. And that's the key thing. Because in practice sometimes people forget about the ultimate objectives and start wondering why they were doing it. We already have a green fashion competition manual. You can download it from the internet. It was used during the competitions, the previous two competitions. There's a lot of information on the internet, way too much of course to find the right information. This one is one from the Global Reporting Initiative. Biodiversity explains the links between businesses and biodiversity. This is the TEEP study that I talked about. And there's also a report on building biodiversity business, which is also an interesting one, which discusses specific materials, specific sectors, and their relation with biodiversity, and to get an understanding of how it works. This afternoon, I will talk a bit more about how to sustain biodiversity, including sources of information, because a lot of it has already been published on fashion, on architecture, on spatial planning, you name it. And also some of the tips based on the first two seasons of the Green Fashion competition. What was lacking in the business reports and what was in there. Thank you for now. Almost in time.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? No? Yes? Yeah? Then there are two mics, I think. Okay. First one. Yeah. Please introduce yourself with your name.
Yes, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Visser. I am from Strawberries Fabrics and I'm also a competitor in the competition. Thank you very much for the nice presentation, but I was a little bit surprised to find palm oil, soil and cotton specifically mentioned also as a crop that is potentially very harmful for biodiversity. And I think that is a little bit unfortunate because I think it depends very much how the cotton is grown. So I think it's quite important to point out that if you mention cotton as a harmful crop, it is important to mention that it is if it's done on large estates with a lot on an industrial scale And that it's maybe also important that, for instance, in Africa, where it is grown by small farmers, so if the cotton is produced by small producers, that it is actually a very good crop, and that it is definitely also not competitive to the food production, what was also mentioned, which I also do not agree. And also that it's generally not grown in a rainforest area, but in a very arid zone, so that I think it's economically a very important crop, specifically for small growers in arid regions.
So what is the specific question you have?
Well, it's not a question, it's just a remark.
Okay.
That please be careful if you mention cotton with palm oil and with soil. I do agree with the other two, but I definitely not agree with the third one, cotton.
Wijnand, do you have a quick answer to this remark?
Very quick.
Yeah.
Very good to mention. I think it illustrates the fact what I mentioned, that there's also a relation between pressures and an impact area. Certain pressures will not lead to an impact in certain areas. And there's also a link, I think what you also mean, between the way you produce it and also the size of production. When you look worldwide, in general, cotton and other commodities are main drivers of biodiversity loss, one way or another. Of course, that may not be so for the small producers in India, but it is very much so, very much true for the real big, large farm estates that you have in the United States, but also in other countries.
Another question?
My name is Wijnand. I used to work for Unilever, and they have a big plan now, a big sustainable plan about how to save the planet. I was wondering, how do you look at that plan? Because you are saying a lot of big companies who can make a really big impact are doing a little bit the input of inside-outside strategy. And I think, is Unilever really wondering about the biodiversity as a system, or more, if we save water, well, that sounds better for our consumer? I'm wondering about your vision about that.
It's good that we now have an inside-outside. Well, I think Unilever is one of the cases that you have. There are, I mentioned a few front runners also, that you have also in the area of biodiversity. We call them the usual suspects that you will also always find at meetings. And Unilever is one of them. I actually went with one person from Unilever to Brazil to look at, okay, what kind of influence can they have on soy production and the loss of biodiversity caused by soy production, being Unilever. How can they influence this? And Unilever is one example of a company that within the company has a lot more knowledge on biodiversity than we have within my consultancy firm. So there are big differences. The thing is, companies like Unilever will always end up somewhere in the newspaper with bad news. But they're also part of the front runners when you're talking about sustainability, also with their new plan. The person that I went with to Brazil was also part of the International Food Lab, thinking about the food production in the future. And of course, that's not just because they want the best for society, but it's also because of their own stakes. And they depend on biodiversity a lot when you look at companies like Unilever. But I think their performance on biodiversity is among the front runners. They were the chair of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, Unilever. They are one of the participants in the Roundtable on the Responsible Tea. They're involved in the Roundtable on Responsible Soy. So they're involved in many of these new programs because also they want to influence it, I guess, but also because they have a lot of knowledge within the company.
Can I add a question? Yeah. What is the worst company in this field?
The worst one?
Yeah. In your point of view.
In my point of view, I have no idea. I think in general companies that put profits in front of everything. Companies that have some kind of an old school thinking where you still look at only at the profits that you make every 3 months instead of the long-term benefits. And those can be the smaller free riders, for example, but specific names, I do not have for you.
Okay. One more question. Time for one more question.
That's a good and very complex question, I guess. The whole, what I mentioned, the TEEP study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, international study, You can compare it to what they did the same for climate change years ago, where they calculated the benefits from biodiversity. And I guess the ins and outs of those calculations I do not know, and I think I do not want to know, because I think it's very complex. But I guess it's a combination of actual value of sectors, because you can link specific ecosystem services to sectors, and you can also calculate what is the turnover or maybe the profit of a specific sector. But I guess there's also a lot of assumptions in there to get a complete picture. But I don't know the details. You can probably find them in the reports that they produced.
Maybe a company like Unilever does have those figures with their own production.
Yeah, I know a company like Unilever. They have their own biodiversity methodology, where they really have different biodiversity indicators that they use on their production sites, but also in their supply chains, to measure change. And that's how they work on biodiversity. Whether they also translate it into financial profits or losses, I'm not sure. I guess they probably will, but you would have to ask them.
Okay, thank you very much. One more time, big applause, please, for Wijnand.